war is often remembered through battles, losses, and turning points. But long before the first shot is fired, a quieter question appears: how it will all be paid for. For much of American history, the answer seemed obvious: gold. Gold was stability. Gold was security. Gold was the ultimate guarantee that the nation could endure whatever came next. And yet, during America's largest and most expensive wars, the gold itself rarely moved. Before we begin, if you enjoy calm, documentary-style stories about real treasure, history, and the systems behind them, consider liking the video and subscribing. It quietly supports the continuation of stories like this. This is not a story about the battlefield. Text it is a story about locked doors, written promises, and decisions made far from the sound of war. According to historical records, while conflict demanded enormous resources, the gold meant to represent that wealth often remained untouched, sealed behind steel, deep underground. If the gold never moved, what truly paid the price? To understand this question, we must first understand where America's gold actually was. By the early 20th century, vast reserves were no longer scattered across frontier towns or private vaults. They were centralized, stored in heavily guarded facilities, federal buildings, and secure underground chambers designed for permanence, not movement. These places were not built for urgency. They were built for time. Text-thick stone walls, reinforced steel doors, and controlled interiors reflected a belief that gold's power came not from circulation, but from its continued existence, unseen, untouched, and unquestioned. Contemporary accounts suggest that as wars grew larger and more complex, the physical location of gold became less important than the idea of gold itself. Its presence reassured markets, stabilized confidence, and supported systems that operated without ever opening the vaults. The geography of gold was static. The world outside was not. And somewhere between those two realities, a quiet shift began. The idea that gold did not need to move in order to matter did not appear suddenly. It emerged slowly, through a series of early decisions that were practical rather than philosophical. Text in the 19th century, American wars were still financed in familiar ways. Gold and silver coins circulated. Physical reserves were drawn down. The link between metal and payment was visible, tangible, and easy to understand. But as the scale of conflict increased, that visibility became a liability. Moving gold was slow, risky, exposed. Transport required guards, logistics, and time, all of which were scarce during war. According to historical records, early financial officials began to experiment with an alternative approach. Instead of sending gold to pay for materials, wages, and supplies, they issued promises backed by the gold's continued existence. The metal stayed where it was. The obligation moved instead. This shift was not presented as a revolution. Text it was framed as efficiency, a temporary solution to a practical problem. Yet with each conflict, the same logic returned, and each time, it stayed a little longer. Contemporary accounts suggest that by the early 20th century, gold had become less a means of payment and more a foundation of trust. It no longer needed to circulate. It only needed to remain unquestioned. The first people to understand this were not soldiers or citizens. They were administrators, bankers, and policymakers, individuals who rarely appeared in wartime imagery, yet shaped the financial architecture beneath it. The war was fought elsewhere. The decision about gold was made quietly. For the public, the belief remained simple: America had gold, and gold paid for war. It was a comforting assumption. Text gold was finite, heavy, real. If it existed in sufficient quantity, then victory felt assured. But reality was more abstract. Later historical analysis indicates that during major conflicts, The majority of wartime spending was not settled with physical gold at all. Instead, it was financed through borrowing, deferred payment, and institutional credit, mechanisms that relied on confidence rather than metal. The gold remained locked away, while the cost was distributed across time. This disconnect created a subtle tension between expectation and truth. Citizens imagined vault doors opening to fund the war effort. In reality, those doors stayed closed, while new layers of obligation accumulated elsewhere. Gold became symbolic, a silent witness rather than an active participant. Text the expectation was permanence. The reality was transformation. What people believed gold was doing, and what it actually supported, began to diverge. Yet because the system functioned, few questioned the difference. After all, nothing appeared to be missing. The vaults were still full. The war was still being paid for. And so the illusion held, not through deception, but through distance. The further gold moved from daily life, the easier it became to accept its role without examining its function. This gap between belief and reality would shape everything that followed. If gold did not move, the cost of war did not disappear. It simply shifted. The winners were not always visible. They were not marching, and they were rarely named. Text existed within systems that benefited from stability, predictability, and time. The losses were quieter. According to historical records, wartime financing spread its burden across populations that often never saw the immediate effects. Debt was issued. Taxes were adjusted. Future obligations were created without urgency or ceremony. The price of war was no longer paid at once. It was paid gradually. This distribution softened the shock. It allowed wars to last longer than gold reserves alone would have permitted. But it also meant that the true cost was harder to measure and easier to postpone. Text contemporary accounts suggest that while industries expanded and institutions strengthened, individuals absorbed the consequences indirectly through inflation, delayed growth, and obligations passed forward. No single moment marked the payment. No visible exchange took place. Gold remained untouched, while its symbolic value underwrote decisions that reshaped entire economies. In this system, there were no immediate losers, only delayed ones. The cost was not denied. It was deferred. And deferral, when repeated often enough, begins to feel like absence. Every system reaches a moment when its original logic no longer applies. For gold, that moment did not arrive with collapse or crisis. It arrived with acceptance. Text later historical analysis indicates that once policymakers realized wars could be financed without mobilizing physical reserves, gold ceased to function as a practical limit. It became a reference point rather than a restraint. This was the turning point. From that moment on, the question was no longer how much gold existed, but how much confidence could be sustained. The vaults no longer defined the boundary of action. They became background, present, reassuring, and increasingly irrelevant to day-to-day decisions. This shift did not eliminate gold's importance. It redefined it. Gold was no longer asked to act. It was asked to remain. The world had changed. Speed mattered more than weight. Systems mattered more than substance. Text and war, once constrained by physical resources, became governed by abstractions that could expand as needed. The doors stayed closed. The consequences did not. What followed would shape not only how wars were paid for, but how power itself was measured. When gold stepped aside from its active role, it did not vanish. It remained physically present, carefully guarded, and largely untouched. What changed was not the metal, but the meaning attached to it. The vault still existed. The records were still kept. Inventories were maintained with precision. According to historical records, the presence of gold continued to be cited as reassurance, proof of stability in a world increasingly governed by movement and speed. But its role had narrowed. Gold no longer determined what could be done. Text it merely confirmed what had already been decided. What was left behind were spaces designed for permanence, silent rooms, reinforced doors, shelves built to last longer than memory. These places became monuments not to use, but to restraint. At the same time, something less visible accumulated elsewhere. Paper obligations multiplied. Ledgers thickened. Numbers grew without weight or sound. The system learned to expand without drawing from its physical core. Contemporary accounts suggest that this separation created a strange balance. The gold provided confidence, while everything else absorbed change. The metal did not disappear. Its absence was functional, not physical. And so what remained was a paradox, a treasure preserved by not being used, valued most when left untouched. Text in retrospect, this shift marked more than a change in financing. It signaled a new relationship between power and material reality. Later historical analysis indicates that once gold stopped acting as a constraint, the nature of national decision-making changed. Limits became theoretical. Boundaries depended less on resources and more on consensus. This was not unique to war, but war revealed it most clearly. America's growing role on the global stage was supported not by the movement of gold, but by the confidence that gold represented something larger: continuity, obligation, and belief in the system itself. Gold became a reference point for trust rather than a mechanism of payment. Text this transformation reshaped international relationships, monetary systems, and expectations about responsibility. The weight of decisions no longer rested on metal, but on institutions capable of sustaining belief. The historical meaning of gold shifted quietly, without ceremony. What once limited action now legitimized it, and in that change, a new model of power emerged, one less visible, more abstract, and far more enduring than any physical reserve. Even after gold stopped paying for war in any direct sense, the belief that it did never fully disappeared. Gold is easy to understand. It has weight. It occupies space. It feels permanent. Abstract systems do not. Text for most people, it is far more comforting to imagine was being funded by something tangible than by layers of obligation stretching into the future. Gold provides closure. It suggests that the cost has been settled, contained, and accounted for. According to later historical analysis, this psychological attachment played a quiet but powerful role. As long as gold remained untouched and visibly secure, confidence could be maintained. Even as the mechanisms of payment grew increasingly distant, the public did not demand to see the ledgers. They only needed to know the vaults were full. This expectation simplified a complex reality. It allowed people to accept outcomes without tracing their origins. Text responsibility felt finite when associated with metal, rather than open-ended when tied to debt. Gold became a narrative anchor. It did not explain the system, but it made the system easier to live with. And so the belief persisted, not because it was accurate, but because it was useful. The consequences of this shift did not appear immediately. They unfolded slowly, over decades. Without gold acting as a direct constraint, the scale of action expanded. Wars could be prolonged. Commitments could be extended. Decisions no longer had to wait for physical settlement. According to historical records, this new flexibility altered the relationship between time and cost. Payment moved further into the future, while action moved ever faster. The effects were uneven. Some benefited from stability and growth. Others absorbed long-term pressure through inflation, taxation, and economic uncertainty. The system did not collapse, it adapted. But adaptation came with trade-offs. Gold, once a limiter, had become a symbol. And symbols do not impose boundaries. They reassure, even as obligations accumulate elsewhere. The consequences were not dramatic. They They were structural. By the time the full impact became visible, the system was already too large to reverse. The vault doors remained closed. The balance had already shifted. In the end, the most revealing detail is not how much gold existed, but how rarely it was asked to act. The wars were fought. The decisions were made. The costs were absorbed. Text, and through it all, the gold remained largely untouched, silent, preserved, and physically unchanged. This was not neglect. It was a choice. By keeping gold still, America built a system where action no longer depended on material limits, but on confidence, continuity, and belief in institutions. The metal did not disappear from the story. It simply stopped being the protagonist. According to historical records, the vaults remain secure, their contents carefully recorded and protected. Yet their role is no longer to pay for what happens outside their walls. They exist as reassurance. Gold became a promise that no longer needed to be fulfilled in motion, only maintained in appearance. And that raises a final question. Text, if the gold never moved, if it never truly paid for the wars fought in its name, what, in the end, was it really protecting?